Do you remember the show Mythbusters? There's this TV show where these guys, Jamie and Adam and their crew, they would take these things that we believe to be true and these urban myths and legends and things like that, and they would test them out to see if there was any truth in them. And one of the ones that they did that was really interesting was testing out the 5-second rule. You know how this goes. If your dad's anything like mine, if you dropped a piece of food on the floor, he would immediately yell, 5-second rule, and you'd have to pick it up and eat it. As long as you did it quickly, as the story goes, you would be fine. This is one of those things that's so universally accepted because it does, in theory, make sense. But is it true? Unfortunately, for all of you 5-second rule believers, the answer is no. It turns out that the amount of bacteria on a piece of food that's dropped on the floor is almost identical after 2 seconds as it is after 6 seconds. And that's not all. That's not the only one of these things that we believe that turns out not to be true. Did you know that you actually can fold a piece of paper in half more than 7 times? Also, apparently you can sneeze with your eyes open. And for my arachnophobic friends, it turns out the daddy long-legged spider does not have the most potent venom of any spider. Unfortunately, it does have fangs that are large enough to puncture your skin, so that one's kind of a wash. Here's the thing. There are so many of these things that we believe to be true, these universally accepted truths that have something in them that makes sense, that we can identify with, and in the end, they aren't exactly so. They aren't quite true. Sometimes this happens in regard to our faith. See, we can get so easily locked into the idea that faith and doubt are like polar opposites. Like they're battling it out and one will eventually defeat the other because only one can exist within us at the same time. And for some, that's the reason they can't have faith. And for others, that's the reason they can't have questions. As we open our Bibles today, we're going to look at this moment, a conversation between Jesus and a man who has questions and doubts. And what we'll see is that in these questions and doubts, they weren't the opposite of faith. They were an opportunity to grow faith. Before we jump into this story, I want to set the scene a little bit. So Jesus, he had taken Peter and James and John, and they had gone up on this mountain where he's transfigured. What that means is that his physical appearance was like drastically changed. We're told that his clothes shone brilliantly, dazzlingly white. All this happens right before their eyes. And then these two prophets from the history of Israel, Elijah and Moses, these mighty men of God who had been long gone, they appeared and they have a conversation with Jesus. And there's this voice from heaven. You know the one. It's the one that sounds like James Earl Jones at Booms. "This is my son whom I love. Listen to him." And then just like that, it's over. And so these guys, they leave this mountaintop experience and they walk back into the real world. They're approaching the rest of the disciples, and those disciples are surrounded by this large crowd arguing with Jewish religious leaders. And we can find this in our Bibles in Mark chapter 9, starting in verse 14. Here's what it says. When they came to the other disciples, they saw a large crowd around them and the teachers of the law arguing with them. As soon as all the people saw Jesus, they were overwhelmed with wonder and ran to greet him. "What are you arguing with them about?" he asked. A man in the crowd answered, "Teacher, I brought you my son who is possessed by a spirit that has robbed him of speech. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him to the ground. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. I asked your disciples to drive out the spirit, but they could not." "You unbelieving generation," Jesus replied, "how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy to me." So they brought him. When the spirit saw Jesus, it immediately threw the boy into a convulsion. He fell to the ground, rolled around, foaming at the mouth. Jesus asked the boy's father, "How long has he been like this?" "From childhood," he answered. "It's often thrown him into fire or water to kill him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us." "If you can," said Jesus, "everything is possible for one who believes." Immediately the boy's father exclaimed, "I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief." When Jesus saw that a crowd was running to the scene, he rebuked the impure spirit. "You deaf and mute spirit," he said, "I command you, come out of him and never enter him again." The spirit shrieked and convulsed him violently and came out. The boy looked so much like a corpse that many said, "He's dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him to his feet, and he stood up. God, there's a lot going here. We've got crowds being drawn to Jesus. We've got disciples arguing with religious leaders. We've got demons. We've got disciples who can't deal with the demon. And we've got Jesus doing a miracle. And then we've got this dad. We've got this dad that's worn down by watching his son suffer for years. Who wouldn't be worn down by that? And over those years, there are these questions that have developed in this dad's mind, these questions that he's carrying. Like nothing else has ever worked. Why would this work? Can anybody actually do anything for my son? You can see those questions at play in his mind the way that he asked Jesus to heal his son. He says, but if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us. He's here. He's likely drawn by Jesus' reputation as a miracle worker. And so he brings his son. He's hesitantly hopeful that Jesus will be willing to do something, but he's not willing to get his hopes up. He's been around this block before, and so he doubts that anything can be any different. And Jesus' response to him is just so typically Jesus. If you can, everything is possible for one who believes. With his words, Jesus creates this tension. He knows what he's going to do already, but he's leading this dad somewhere. He's encouraging him to respond. And the words come out as a statement, but they're actually a question. It's the same question the dad has been asking. Do you believe that I can do this? And we're told that the dad's response is instant. But more important, it's honest. This would be the time, if you were going to try to fake something, this would be the time to try to fake some heightened level of faith, something that doesn't exist in you, in the hopes that if you can pretend long enough, something good will happen. But instead, he responds honestly, I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief. It's a confession of faith and a confession of doubt. He owns his doubts. He lays them out to Jesus. And I think that's exactly what Jesus is looking for. It was honest. It was vulnerable. And in response to that, Jesus heals his son. And like I said, there is a lot here, but I think the true focus of this encounter is this conversation between a doubting dad and Jesus about faith. The conversation that reveals that Jesus honors honest doubts and that he loves honest doubters. And that's really good news because, like I said at the beginning, questions and doubts can feel kind of out of place in the church. But the reality is that two things can and typically do exist at the same time. Living in that tension is a part of our lives. We see this in so many ways. We have to find joy in the midst of sorrow so often. We have to find the bright spots on bad days. And we have to be able to see both our faith and our doubt at the same time. And here's the truth. Doubt isn't toxic to faith. Instead, doubt is an invitation to a deeper relationship with God. Here's how that works. In general, we live our lives in this place of relative stability. It doesn't mean everything's perfect, but it means things are manageable. We understand what's going on, how things are going to go. They make sense. And at this point, wherever it is that we fall on the spectrum of faith, whether we are over in a place where our faith is a no-faith faith, or we're on the other side of the spectrum where we are fully bought in to Jesus, our faith is there and it's working for us. We feel settled in that. Think of it this way. Easter was just a few weeks ago, and so this is like the disciples before Jesus' arrest. They know the deal. They know how things work. Sure, from time to time, he says something that upsets people, or he says something that they don't understand, but who doesn't? Here's the thing, though. Things are settled for them. They know how things are going. Then after dinner one night, Jesus gets arrested. And the next day he's killed. What now? It's circumstances like that where questions and doubts thrives, and they did in those disciples as well. And sometimes those circumstances that plunge us into the instability of doubt, they are tragic. They're traumatic. And listen, I know they're hard to hear, but unfortunately, we've all experienced them in some way. This is that place where we hear your doctor saying the words, "I'm sorry, but it's cancer." Or praying so hard for your mom and dad to stay together, but in the end, he still leaves. Or it's when the voice on the other end of the phone says, "There's been an accident." Or it's finding out that you didn't make it through the last round of layoffs and there's not enough money in the bank to keep going. It's pretty much any conversation that starts with, "I don't know how to tell you this." Other times, the circumstances that lead to our doubts and our questions are a little more mundane, like we meet a new group of friends who don't believe the same things we do, and they ask a lot of questions about our faith that we don't know how to answer, and so a seed is planted within us that I don't know how to answer this. And maybe those questions have been there for you all along, but every time you ask another Christian about them, they won't take your question seriously. They just tell you, it doesn't matter. You just got to take it by faith. You can't get someone to take your questions seriously, and so they just stay inside festering. And look, however you get there, whether it's external events or unresolved internal questions, this is a turning point. When you're in a place like this, your doubts, they begin to feel like a barrier to faith. And in the midst of your questions and doubts, you've got a choice to make. You can try to force those doubts and questions down so that you can maintain the faith that you had before. You can pretend that they don't exist or that they don't matter. And sometimes that's the encouragement we get from well-meaning Christians. You just got to have faith, they'll say. And listen, George Michael, I get it. I just got to have faith. And I do, but here's the thing. Here's the thing. It sure would be nice if you could meet me in the midst of this existential life crisis that I'm going through. Offer me some comfort instead of just a trite platitude. Look, as well-meaning as these folks might be with their responses, these sorts of things, they tell us that our doubts are bad, that questions aren't okay, that we shouldn't talk about them. And maybe this strategy works better for some people than others, but more and more I'm convinced that you just got to have faith actually means I don't know either, but I'm too afraid to ask. Maybe they've stuffed their doubts back in. Maybe their question is a threat to the stability, and so they're fighting so hard to maintain that. The problem is that when we stuff our doubts down inside, when we have our questions that we won't face, it may work for a while, but most of the time we're just delaying the inevitable. When we're too scared to face the hard questions about our faith, we stuff them down for too long. When they do come out, they're more likely to do so in a way that is uncontrollable, that is explosive, that's destructive to our faith. They might be the things that cause us to walk away when we won't deal with them. And here's the thing, doubt's not toxic to faith. Silence is. And like I said before, we face a choice here. There is another option. We can choose to lean into our questions and doubts when they arise. We can choose to be vulnerable, to expose those things to the light. Because when our faith grows, when we choose to face our doubts instead of running from them. This interaction with this struggling, doubting dad, Jesus clearly shows that he honors honest doubts, that he loves honest doubters. He shows that he'll meet us there. And he shows that he doesn't want us to stay there. We can move forward when we're willing to wade through that instability of dealing with our doubts and questions. And every time doubts arise and we face them, the process repeats. Our circle of faith, it grows bigger and bigger and bigger each time we walk through this cycle. And listen, I'm not saying that's an easy process. It hasn't been that way for me. I've been a Christian for 25 years. And the hardest parts of my story are the places where I've grown the most, where my faith has been formed most deeply. In those times of wrestling and doubts with questions too big to be quelled by a trite Christian answer, those are the times that I learned that Jesus is who he says he is, and that I learned that he can be trusted. And listen, maybe you're a better Christian than I am, but the faith that I have, however small or big it is, has been hard won in those places. You don't just find a fully formed faith sitting on the shelf ready for you to grab and go. It just doesn't work that way. Faith is a journey. Faith is vulnerability. It's wrestling. Faith is a struggle before it's strong. Faith is brutal before it's beautiful. And it's formed in the questions. It's formed as you walk through them, as you wrestle with them. When you do that, faith can and will be formed in you, and it doesn't happen overnight. It takes time. And parts of it will be painful, but that's where faith is formed. It's formed in the questions. You know, that faith that looks so strong and beautiful, the faith that shows up as rest and trust and peace in the midst of the storm. It was no doubt formed in the face of another storm. And look, if you're someone that's prone to look at other Christians and think they're so much better at this Jesus thing than you are, it's not that. It's just that they have probably already been through something like you're going through. Their faith has been formed in the midst of the questions, in the midst of their doubts. And look, wherever you are on the spectrum of faith, from a faith that is non-existent to a faith that is fully bought in for Jesus, you are not alone in your doubts. If you're watching this and you don't know what you believe about Jesus, maybe you're curious, maybe you don't even know exactly why you're watching at all. Listen, this is why you're watching. Whatever it is that you're wondering, whatever your questions are, whatever questions it is that keeps you from Jesus, don't be afraid. Ask. What do you have to lose? If you're willing to hold those questions up to the light, if you're willing to engage with people who have walked through seasons of doubt and come through the other side, if you're willing to ask your questions, I truly believe that God will honor your honest doubts because he loves you as an honest doubter. If you're vulnerable, if you're willing to open up about the questions you have, I truly believe that he will show up in the midst of that. So ask. There's nothing to lose from finding the truth too, because either way, at least then you'll know whether there's something here or not, and you can move forward. But you should realize that if your expectation is to get to a place where you have zero questions, zero doubts, you're never going to get that. You will never know everything there is to know about God. Your doubt is never going to get neatly tied up in a bow and put away somewhere where you never have to face doubt again. But if you're willing to ask your questions, you will eventually know enough to give God the benefit of the doubt, enough to know that you can trust him, to know that you can trust that he is good, that he is honest, that he loves you. And that's how faith grows. You'll likely always have some doubt, and that's okay. I want you to know that as you wrestle with those questions, we'll be praying for you. We'll be praying that you find the truth. And I'm sure that I can trust God with your questions because I've already trusted him with mine. See, I was the last one in my family to become a Christian. And there were these books that were coming out back then. They were part of this series called the Left Behind series. And they painted this picture of a post-rapture world. Jesus has taken his believers out of the world, and now only people who didn't know him were here, and they had this short window of time through testing and tribulation where they had the opportunity to respond in faith. And I didn't believe that any of this was true, of course, but what if it was? We were part of a small church at the time, so small that I was the only middle school student in the entire place. And so for a Sunday school class, it ended up being me and the pastor of the church. And he asked me, what do you want to learn about? What do you want to talk about? And so having been cognizant of the Left Behind books and picking one up off my parents' bookshelf and reading through it a little bit, I decided that what I wanted to study was the book of Revelation. It's John's vision of how the end of things all happens. And I'm thinking, okay, if I can get the intel on this, then this thing that can't possibly ever be true, if it does happen to actually be true, I can be ready. I can know. I can get on the train before it leaves the station. And so for months, me and the pastor of this small church, we read Revelation. We talked about so many of the interesting things in there. But that didn't make me a Christian either. I wouldn't become a Christian for 3 years later. It took time for me to work through that. It took time for me to get over that hump. And all throughout that time, in fact, long before that time, 2 very faithful Christians, Bob and Edie Buell, my great-grandfather and grandmother, they had been praying every single day that every one of their kids and their grandkids and their great-grandkids would come to know Jesus. Their prayers, and that time that I spent digging into those questions, that is part of what got me across that space. It got me from one side where I've said, no, I have no faith, to the point where I said, okay, I can believe in Jesus. And maybe for you, it's not your doubts and questions that are keeping you from a relationship from God. Maybe you actually are fully bought in for Jesus, but there are things that you are afraid to ask, questions you're afraid to ask because somewhere along the way you picked up the idea that God or church isn't okay with your questions, that it just has to be a blind faith. It can't be an examined faith. Maybe it's a holdover from other authority figures in your life who didn't respond well to questions. Maybe you're afraid to ask because you're afraid of what the answer would be that you would find. Maybe you're afraid that the answer you would find wouldn't be good enough. And maybe you get this weird pit in your stomach whenever difficult topics come up. That was me too. I wrestled with the questions about, is God real, and became a Christian, but I still had questions inside, and I didn't know how to ask those questions. I had asked the questions that got me into the faith, that got me close to Jesus, but I was still so afraid. I can remember the deep physical uneasiness that I would feel anytime questions around faith and science would come up, because those were my questions too. I had trusted Jesus for my salvation, but I wasn't sure. I lived in fear that my beliefs wouldn't hold up under scrutiny. And for so many years, I worried that there would be no reasonable answers for my faith. And so I just stayed quiet. It wasn't until I was doing my undergraduate in youth ministry that I started taking theology courses. And it was in those courses that I got the opportunity to wrestle with those questions. I got to see the Christian answers in textbooks and in discussions that we had in class. And I could finally wrestle through those and come to a place where I can say, okay, I understand. Okay, that I can settle. Those doubts I can settle within me. Look, don't let your doubts scare you. Admitting them won't make God angry. This story shows that God honors honest doubts, that he loves you as an honest doubter. And listen, he already knows your doubts. He knows them. Whatever questions you're struggling with, he knows them. He's waiting for you to lean in. He's waiting for you to lean in so that he can meet you there in the midst of those questions. Doubt's not toxic to faith. Doubt is an invitation to a deeper relationship with God. So don't wait. Don't make excuses. Ask the questions that you have instead of letting them keep you from that deeper relationship. Let them be the thing that helps you get to the deeper relationship with God. It's also possible that you're watching this and you're in a place where you feel really stable in your faith. In fact, you aren't wrestling with doubt, but you know people around you that are. And you know people around you that are struggling with this. You're thinking, okay, I get it. Doubt's not toxic to faith. Silence is. And listen, this is my son. This is my daughter, my niece, my nephew, my grandkid, my husband, my wife, my best friend. And their questions, they scare me. Because I'm afraid that their questions will keep them from ever getting to know Jesus. Maybe somebody that you love is going through this process of deconstructing their faith, and you're afraid their questions are going to be too big, and they're never going to be able to trust in Jesus again. Here's the thing. I want to come alongside them. But how do I do that? How do I do it in a way where I'm actually doing good, where I'm not doing more harm in the midst of that? How do I break the silence in a way that's helpful? Well, thankfully, we have one of Jesus' his brother Jude. He tells us how we can do that. See, in addition to being Jesus' brother, Jude, he was one of the leaders of the Christian movement after Jesus had died. He writes this short letter, one of the shortest of the whole Bibles. It's only 25 verses long. He writes to these followers of Jesus, these early followers, and he says this: Jude, a servant of Jesus Christ and a brother of James, to those who have been called, who are loved in God the Father and kept for Jesus Christ, mercy, peace, and love be yours in abundance. He speaks a prayer of blessing over them at the very beginning, and then he goes on to warn them against false teachers and the teachings that they bring, and he calls them to persevere in the face of those false teachings. And then he hits them with this: be merciless to those who doubt. No, just kidding. He doesn't tell them. He tells them to be merciful to those who doubt. And this is so interesting because church history, church tradition, it tells us that Jesus' family, they didn't actually believe in him when he was alive. So it is possible that Jude, the one who's writing this, is deeply acquainted with doubt. It's possible that he writes this from a place of being one who had needed mercy for not recognizing the truth when it was right there in front of his face. So what he's telling them, be merciful to those who doubt. What he's saying is remember the mercy that I just prayed that you would have. You remember the mercy that my brother showed to you by dying on the cross for you? Show that same mercy to the people that you know who doubt. Don't try to make them feel bad for having questions. Don't shun them. Don't be silent. Extend mercy to them. Because look, if someone trusts you enough to share what they're wrestling with, you are standing on holy ground. So honor it. Honor it by being grateful that they opened up to you. Tell them how grateful you are that they trusted you enough to share what was going on inside their heart. Honor it by listening intently when they're speaking instead of waiting to just jump in with your quick fix answer. Honor it by acknowledging the legitimacy of their thoughts and questions and doubts. Honor it by making room for those things when they come up. making time for them. And if they ask for your thoughts, honor it by answering honestly without skipping over the hard parts. And listen, this is super important, okay? You need to know that it is okay to say when you don't know something. I've got a new mantra for you, in fact. IDK is A-okay. And I know it is the cheesiest thing that anyone has ever said, and I get that, but maybe the cheesiness will help it stick in your brain. IDK is A-okay. I'm a student minister here at Summit, and this is actually part of how we train our Connect Group leaders that work with our students, because no one is better at spotting someone being fake, someone trying to pretend that they know something that they don't, than a teenager. So what we tell them is this: when you face a question that you don't know the answer to, the best response you can possibly give is, I don't know, but I'd love to dig into that with you. I'd love to try to figure that out with you. That's the best thing you can do. When someone opens up to you, you can honor that by being vulnerable and acknowledging your own questions and doubts. And maybe they're similar to the ones that this person that opened up to you has, and that is an awesome point of connection. Maybe they're not, but still at least acknowledge that you have questions and doubts, but do it in a way where it's about connecting with them and not making it about you. Honor where they're at in their story. Let them know that they aren't alone in their doubts, that you can understand where they're coming from. And listen, when you do this, when you extend to them the mercy of companionship in the midst of doubt and questions, you're creating that space for God to show up, for Jesus to show up in the midst of this struggle in their life and do something amazing. Y'all, this dad, he had every reason to doubt. And then when the disciples couldn't do it, when they couldn't heal his son, when they couldn't cast out that demon, he was given even another reason to doubt, another excuse to question whether or not things could ever be any different. And yet he pushed through until Jesus met him there in the midst of it. He gave him what he needed to believe. And listen, I'm not promising you a miracle. In fact, your faith may be the faith that's formed when a miracle doesn't come. I can't promise you that it'll be easy. But what I can promise you is that it's in the storm where our frail and fragile faith gets formed into something stronger and more beautiful. I'm going to say it one last time. Doubt is not toxic to faith. Silence is. Doubt is the catalyst for resolution, for clarity, for courage. Doubt is a gift because without it, we don't grow. So what are your questions? What are you waiting for? Let's pray. God, thanks for being a God that's willing to meet us in the midst of our doubt. Thanks for being a God that doesn't say, you will believe in me and thou shalt not ask any questions. Thanks for being a God who was willing to come to earth, to take our place and pay the penalty for our sins so that we can have a relationship with you and then continue to open yourself up to our questions, even though you are so much bigger and grander than we are. God, I pray that wherever we are on that spectrum in faith, wherever we are in our struggles with doubt, that you would meet us there. Give us the courage to ask our questions. Surround us with folks who are willing and vulnerable enough to open up and help us to walk through it, to walk alongside us in that struggle. And Father, for those of us who love people who are doubting, lead us and guide us in every one of those conversations. Be the one that's ordering our words. Help us create that space for them to encounter you. And God, we pray that you would do the work. Thanks so much for loving us, for always being near to us. We ask all of these things in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ, who is our hope. Amen.
than the night. And when the shadows feel like giants, are you chasing me down? Tell me, where could I run from your heart? Where could I hide? Hemmed within your precious thoughts, there's no hiding from your love. Highs and lows, Lord, you're with me either way it goes. Should I rise or should I fall? Your mercies in even flow. You're too good to let me go. Should I dance on the heights or make my bed among the doubts? Your mercy waits at every end, like you planned it from the start. Should the dawn come with wings or find me far side of the sea, there your hand still fastens me, ever closer to your heart. You're with me the way it goes. Should I rise or should I fall? Even so, Lord, your mercies in even flow. Should I rise or should I fall? You are faithful through it all, and you're too good to let me go.
I know for many of you who are watching right now, you're listening to worship and you just listened to an incredible sermon, but you too have doubt and you have questions. But Chad reminded us that our doubt is not toxic to our faith. It is actually silence. That God invites us even when we are doubting. He doesn't expect for us to stay there. However, we can meet the face of God even in those pits of doubt. Thank you, Chad, for such a wonderful reminder.
And we'd invite you to follow along with us on social media and subscribe to our YouTube channel so that you never miss another sermon and you get to interact with all the great content we're putting out every week. That's all we have for you guys today. We're so looking forward to seeing you next week.